Ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking for a review of a high-end analog keyboard worth almost $200 from a hardware expert who can tell you exactly which keyboard switches it uses by taste alone, you are very much in the wrong place. However, if you're looking for the opinion of an average guy who just wanted to know whether or not an analog keyboard would work well with the sort of games he was playing, and also wanted to say the word wooting as many times as possible, then this is the video for you. Now, if you're not a keyboard aficionado, you may be wondering what on earth an analog keyboard is and why you should care. Actually, what you're probably wondering is, $200 for a keyboard? Are you mad? Yes, probably. We all know that the keys on a keyboard are either pressed or they're not pressed, right? There's no in between. You don't get like half a W or half a C. You're pressing the thing or you're not pressing the thing. It's what we call a digital input device. And for the most part, this is perfectly fine. You want to press a key to do a certain thing, maybe open a map, open a door, select a weapon. But we also use the keys on the keyboard usually for movement. And that's where the digital nature can work against us a little. Not in all games. There are plenty of games where we just want to move forward or backwards, left, right, and we really don't care about, doing it slowly or gracefully. Although I think we've all had those moments where we've been following an NPC and we keep sort of moving quickly forward and then having to stop and then forward and stop and forward and stop because we cannot match their speed. But that's a minor thing in the grand scheme of things. But there are also games out there where there would be an actual in-game advantage to having analog input. And I'm thinking of games where you've got to, say, drive a car or fly a plane. Because, of course, with a standard keyboard, you're either accelerating at full acceleration or you're not. You're either turning full left or you're not. You can't turn half left or a quarter right. Now, mouse and keyboard users, we all know there are ways to get around this. We're all accustomed to tapping the keyboard very quickly, feathering it, to try and mimic an analog input, but it's not the same. It isn't. It's one of the times where, as much as it pains us to have to admit it, controllers, well, they've got an advantage. In this one case, they're better. I hate saying it, but it's true. However, with analog keyboards, that might all be about to change. Enter the Wooting. Well, more specifically in my case, it's the Wooting 60HE, which is the small form factor 60% version of the full keyboard. But I imagine everything I'm going to say will apply to the full keyboard as well. Now, I did record myself unboxing the keyboard. However, I used a handheld action cam and an overhead webcam that was 1080p because that's pretty much all I have. And I realized that if I uploaded much of that, all I would get were 1,000 complaints that I made people's eyes bleed. So we're not going to do much of that. The current price for this keyboard at the time of making this video is between about $175 and $200, depending where you are in the world. It was $175 for the US, it was the same here in Norway, and it was slightly more than that in Germany, about 190 euros. That price includes the keyboard, it includes the keycaps, which do not come pre-assembled. You will have to build the keyboard yourself, so to speak. It comes with a nice quality cable, USB-C, and there's a weird carrying handle that I really don't understand why anyone would want that, to be honest, unless you're just wandering around with a 60% keyboard swinging from your wrist. I didn't install it, however I did also order the handrest, which is actually pretty nice. It fits very well on the keyboard, feels very comfortable. I ordered the carry case, even though I've not used it yet, and I also ordered some keyboard lube, because that's a thing. To my untrained eyes and hands, this product does feel high quality. The case itself is plastic, but the whole unit, once put together, has a very solid and somewhat heavy feel to it. It's reassuringly sturdy. There are little rubber feet on the underside that help keep it in place on the desk, and it really does stay where I put it. I've used this for a while now, and it has never once moved when I didn't want it to move. Once I installed the keycaps onto the keyboard, I did the obligatory shake test that I know is expected in these videos, so that you can hear what the keyboard sounds like if you're using it in the middle of an earthquake or something. And then I recorded myself pressing the keys so that you could get an idea of how it would sound. The key presses felt reasonably smooth. There was a bit of resistance, but no more resistance than you would expect from most keyboards. What I will tell you is you don't get that feeling once the key has activated. So even on a membrane keyboard, there's a point where the key sort of gives a little, and you know that's the point where you've successfully pressed. On more clicky keyboards, you will actually hear and feel a click. You don't get that with an analog keyboard for obvious reasons, but it doesn't feel mushy or unpleasant, or at least it doesn't feel that way to me. I don't do much typing on keyboards though. As I've already mentioned, the handrest fits very nicely against the keyboard, and it's very comfortable to use for long gaming sessions. And if for some reason you are just listening to this video and not looking, the keyboard itself is quite plain and no nonsense. It's very minimalistic, and when you don't have it plugged in, it's really unassuming. However, once you plug it in, the LED lighting kicks in, and it is pretty spectacular. Or it can be. You can actually set it up exactly as you want. You can have a subtle lighting that highlights certain keys or changes the color of other keys to make them easier to find, or you can just have a complete light show and get hypnotized. However, at this point, I do realize many of you are screaming at the screen, "Oh my god, it's been 10 minutes and you haven't even told me how it works when gaming. That's all I want to know. What's it like to play games with it?" So let's start with first-person shooter-type gameplay. This keyboard pretty much feels identical to a normal digital keyboard for the majority of the play. If you're running at full speed or strafing at full speed, it's pretty much gonna feel exactly as your old keyboard did. It's just when you want to start doing slow, calm, more controlled movement, you're going to be able to. And it's very, very easy to adapt to that. I found myself moving much more fluidly, much smoother when, say, following NPCs. You didn't have to keep doing that, move quick, stop, when following an NPC who was talking to you. I found that when I was trying to avoid crowds as I was moving around, my movements were just a lot smoother and less aggressive, and the footage that I was making was a lot easier to view. In those moments, it's more like the sort of footage you would get when using a controller. So basically, you can play fast and furious when you need to, and then slow it down and make it a little more fluid when you get the opportunity. Now, I know some of you at this point are probably thinking, wait a minute, does the analog nature interfere with games that really require very responsive input? Serious FPS games, the Counter-Strike type games. And the answer is no. In fact, this keyboard is brilliant for those, although you probably wouldn't use it in its analog mode. I'll talk about that a little later. However, what I will say is the analog nature of the keyboard does very little to improve your FPS gaming, so to speak. It makes it smoother, more viewable, but that's something that's more interesting to a YouTuber such as myself and less to the average gamer. If you want smooth gameplay, if you want to control your movement speed, yes, this keyboard is going to allow you to do that. But to really say that this keyboard is actually going to improve your gameplay, we're going to have to move over to something that can benefit from it. Driving, for example. So, Does the analog nature of this keyboard help with driving? Yes, it does. Massively. Especially at the low speeds. You will be able to control how much acceleration you apply. You will be able to turn little bits without having to constantly tap the keys, feathering them constantly. You will have a much easier time of driving slowly through mountains with the Porsche without kangarooing and really looking like a learner driver. I will warn you though, once things start to speed up and you're driving more aggressively and trying to weave in and out of traffic, you may find yourself fighting muscle memory. I know I did. I found myself still tapping the keys quickly to try and simulate an analog input, even though I no longer had to. Now, the good news is, that still works. So when your muscle memory kicks in, you will still play exactly the way you played before. But of course, you're using an analog keyboard because you want to avoid doing that. I'm afraid that's just going to take a little time. I spent about an hour driving around in circles in Cyberpunk 2077 trying to get used to it, and I did. I began to really feel like I was getting on top of it, but then every now and again something would happen and I would tense up a little bit and I would go back to just slamming my finger down and then feathering it as quickly as possible. It's very hard to retrain that quickly. So it could take some hours, it could take some weeks depending on how ingrained those habits are. However, I can tell you I immediately felt like I was more in control of the car, not just at the slow speeds where it's really noticeable, but even at the high speeds. I was losing the back end of the car a lot less with the analog setup. I was able to sort of really pick the right speed to just weave in and out of traffic, and it was a lot more of a pleasant experience. So for driving, this keyboard is a major win. The only other game that I tried driving in was Sons of the Forest, because you can now drive electric golf carts around the forest, and it works just fine there too. I haven't tried any games where there is flying yet, because the only such games that I have are games where it's pure flying, and I would use joystick for those games anyway. I'm going to need a game like Starfield where you're transitioning from first-person shooter type perspective to flying perspective, and thus want to use mouse and keyboard for both. Once I try that, I may do an update to this video, but honestly, my gut feeling is it's going to be the exact same as the driving. It's probably going to be a massive improvement, but it will take time to kick muscle memory if you have muscle memory from such games. Now, you may be wondering whether or not this keyboard is compatible with most games, and the answer is probably. It's very much going to depend. You see, the way this keyboard works is when you set up an analog profile, it mimics a controller. It can mimic all of the buttons and all of the joysticks and triggers on a controller. So when I switch to an analog mode, what I'm actually doing is I'm replacing the WASD keys with the thumbstick for movement. And if your game supports controller and mouse and keyboard at the same time, it should work out of the gate. So Fallout New Vegas, for example, worked straight away. Sons of the Forest worked without any, changes whatsoever. Amnesia the Bunker worked straight away. But Fallout 4 didn't work straight away. Why? Because when it detects you using a controller, it switches off the mouse and keyboard, which is very annoying. Luckily, there's a mod that lets you fix that for Fallout 4. But there are some games where it's going to be a little tougher. For example, Horizon Zero Dawn. That's a game where as soon as it detected me pressing the keys for movement, it thought I was using a controller and it disabled my mouse. So at the moment, I've not been able to use this keyboard, well, in its analog state for that game. However, you don't need to worry about such games because you can always switch straight back to a digital profile without having to exit the game, without having to use any software. You can switch between profiles from the keyboard in a fraction of a second. So, in conclusion, if you are playing a game that allows both controller and mouse and keyboard at the same time, this keyboard will work right out of the gate, and you will almost certainly find yourself able to move in a much smoother manner, and in some games that have elements of driving, etc., you will actually notice an improvement in gameplay. How much of an improvement will vary on how quickly you adapt to the analog nature of the keyboard. And for those games that don't support controller and mouse at the same time, you can easily switch back to a digital profile, and this is still an exceptionally good keyboard for gaming. The Wooting 60HE has a lot of other superb features that will be very attractive to a lot of gamers. Now personally, I could end this video right here. I've answered the question that I wanted to answer. Does an analog keyboard actually give you some advantages when in game? But I know some of you are probably curious as to the other features that this keyboard has. Now, I really am probably not the right person to show you them. I've only scratched the surface of what the Wooting 60HE can do, but I will at least try to give you a taste of the possibilities this keyboard offers. This keyboard is incredibly customizable. You can change an awful lot of things, and I'm not just talking about the LED lighting, although you've got full control of that. You can actually set up different profiles with different LED settings, which is actually useful for knowing what profile you're on just by glancing down. You can even set different profiles for when pressing the function key. So I've set it so that when I press the function key here, it highlights the keys that will act as arrows or page up, page down, etc. There are a ton of very fun and somewhat hypnotic options. For example, on the racing profile, you can set it so it shows you how far you're pressing a key on the number keys, which is oddly entertaining. You can change the color and intensity of each key individually. You can add different RGB effects to have a wave effect on the keyboard, or maybe you want scan lines. There's a ripple effect, which is kind of, again, oddly hypnotic, especially if you press the keyboard very, very quickly. Not totally sure that's something you're supposed to be doing with a keyboard while playing games, but hey, it's there. You've got the jelly setting, which basically lights up depending on how hard you press the key, etc. You can pretty much play around with it and get it set how you want. It's more fun than it should be. And all of these settings are saved to the keyboard itself, so you don't need any software installed on the computer. There's even a web interface to control this. You just hit save to keyboard and it's done. You can take the keyboard with you, change computers, and all of your settings will remain. But more importantly, if you're a gamer, you can tweak things like the activation point for each key. If I go along to the Performance tab, I can set the actuation point. It's currently on the Rapid profile at 0.4 millimeters. This means if I press a key 0.4 millimeters down, it will activate. For my typing profile, I've got a slightly less sensitive setup, 1 millimeter minimum press. And the incredible thing is you can change the activation point for each key individually. That is more useful than you think. What I did notice was when I set the activation point very low, I would often accidentally trigger the movement keys because I rested my fingers on those keys. With this level of control, I could tweak it so that I was less likely to do that, whilst keeping all of the other keys hypersensitive, or perhaps make the grenade key slightly less sensitive. Now, I know some of you may be worrying about the analog nature or the fact that you set the actuation point to say 1 millimeter or to 0.4 millimeters, and then when you release a key, it takes all this travel distance before it travels over the actuation point and stops. Because of course some of you are playing seriously fast games where you want to be sidestepping, and as soon as you release that key you want to stop on a dime, and you're looking at all of this lag time, milliseconds, which, you know, I know for a lot of us doesn't mean much, but for some of you it's critically important. Don't worry, this keyboard has got you covered. There is a feature called Rapid Trigger that you can enable, and what that will do is basically you can set the actuation point to 0.4 and it will start to activate. You'll see the green on the key appear, but the instant I start lifting the spacebar even slightly, it turns the key off. So you get super fast actuation and super fast deactivation. You can set this on individual keys as well if you want. You can remap each and every key with a simple drag and drop system that, don't worry, you can undo it as well without saving it. There is an advanced key remapping, and I've not even begun to play with that. Gamepad mapping, this is how it does the analog control in games. As you can see here, I've set the WASD keys to mimic the Xbox controller, but I can set all of these other buttons, again drag and drop, depending on the game. I can even tweak the gamepad response so that, for example, at the moment it's got a bit of a dead zone and a very linear climb, but maybe I want a smoother curve, a more aggressive curve, a really slow curve early on. You can completely customize this, change it to your heart's content. See what works for you for each individual game. This is the level of control that you've got with this keyboard. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm going to leave this video. Thank you for making it this far and listening to my, well, less than expert opinion regarding this product, and honestly, I do like it. In fact, I don't just like it, I love it. I'm a big fan of the analog nature of this keyboard. However, if you are in the market for such a keyboard, it is $175. You probably should check out some actual hardware experts and just get some reliable information. As I mentioned, I will probably make a follow-up video once Starfield is out and I've had a chance to try out flying with this keyboard. And I'd love it if you could join me for that video. I look forward to seeing you there if you care to join me. And until then, remember as always, have fun.